The traditional folklore of nearly every culture on Earth is replete with stories of little mischievous people who live at the edge of civilization, concealed from mortal eyes behind some preternatural veil from which they rarely emerge. Over the millennia, these elusive neighbors have been blamed for all sorts of bizarre phenomena for which no rational explanations readily present themselves, such as mysterious wilderness disappearances, missing household items which later appear in conspicuous locations, sudden undesirable changes in babies, and tiny braids which inexplicably appear overnight in the manes and tails of horses. The Inuit called their mischievous neighbors Inuks. The Filipino called them Duendes. Hawaiians called them Menehune, and Icelanders called them Huldufolk. In the spring of 2021, I published a video on Little People traditions and Canadian settler folklore, which went on to become one of my most popular productions. One of the most interesting stories in that piece is set in Gimli, Manitoba, a settlement on the southwestern shores of Lake Winnipeg, founded in 1875 by Icelandic Canadian immigrants. This modern-day saga begins in 1975, when a school teacher was nearly brained by a large limestone brick which unexpectedly fell from the wall of the Gimli public school. Due to safety concerns, the local Evergreen School Division decided to close the school, unable or unwilling to make the renovations necessary to bring the historic building up to code. In 1994, at the height of a local effort to restore the abandoned building and save it from demolition, a handful of prairie newspapers ran a charming story which imbued the old schoolhouse with a new aura of mystery and magic. According to this modern-day fairy tale, demolition of the Gimli public school would be a grave injustice to Snorri and Snaebjorn, a pair of Huldufolk who lived in its attic. These elusive unpaying tenants, the story goes, had immigrated to Canada from Iceland in the 1870s, stowing themselves away in the steamers that carried some of Canada's first Icelandic Canadian immigrants across the Atlantic to the land of the maple leaf. Like many of their fellow immigrants, Snorri and Snaebjorn established themselves in the burgeoning town of Gimli, Manitoba, taking up residence on the second floor of Turgeson's general store. When the store's second floor was removed in the 1920s, the little people relocated to the attic of Gimli's newly constructed brick schoolhouse, where they have remained ever since. According to the newspaper articles which detailed this fresh new piece of Gimli folklore, the story of Snorri and Snaebjorn was brought to public awareness by Gimli native Dr. Leo Kristjanson, the late president of the University of Saskatchewan, who had returned to his hometown when he learned that his childhood school was scheduled for an indefinite appointment with a wrecking ball. While attending the Gimli public school in his youth, he allegedly bumped into the school's resident goblins, as only children and true believers are able to do. With the fate of the historic building now hanging in the balance, he decided that the time had come to reveal his childhood experience to the general public and show the town what they stood to lose if they demolished the old school. Dr. Kristjanson's story, the articles contend, was subsequently picked up by writer Kathleen Arnason and illustrator Jerry Johnson, who immortalized it in their children's book, The Story of the Gimli Huldufolk. In April 2022, Kathleen Arnason herself got in touch with me and informed me that the newspaper articles from which I had drawn had it all backwards. The story of the Gimli Huldufolk did not originate with Dr. Kristjanson, as stated in the articles, but rather with her. Arnason's relationship with the Huldufolk of Gimli, Manitoba, I learned, far predated the Historic Preservation Campaign of 1994. As a child growing up in Gimli, Kathleen had several vivid nocturnal encounters with mysterious little people who crowded around her bed at night and watched her while she slept. Little did she know that these strange childhood experiences corresponded perfectly with a belief once held by regional old-timers that Gimli, like all Icelandic Canadian communities, was haunted by Huldufolk. It was only during a trip she made years later to Iceland, the land of her ancestors, that Arnason made the connection between her strange childhood experiences and the legendary hidden people of Icelandic tradition. In the early 1990s, Arnason joined the crusade to save the Gimli public school from demolition, working alongside Dr. Kristjanson and other members of the Gimli Heritage Committee to restore the historic building to its former glory. While renovating the school's attic, Arnason suggested to Kristjanson that the secluded alcove would be the perfect place for Huldufolk to live. The former university president seized upon the idea and in a roundabout way, encouraged Arnason to write a children's book on that very subject, which advice she followed. With Kristjanson's permission, Arnason made the former U of S president a major character in her book, formulating a story about two ancient Huldufolk who lived in the attic of the Gimli public school, whom Kristjanson encountered during his elementary school days in the 1930s and 40s. Journalists who reported on the book in 1994 took the story at face value, stating, incorrectly, that the tale of the Gimli Huldufolk originated with Dr. Kristjanson, who allowed Arnason to dramatize it in her book. In my 2021 video, I drew from an article written by a Manitoba University student, who quoted a certain Gimli resident as having said that Dr. Kristjanson later expressed his regret that Arnason had visually depicted Snorri and Snaebjorn in her book, believing that children ought to be allowed to develop their own conceptions of the little people. Kathleen Arnason found this statement troubling and inexplicable, telling me that, rather than criticizing her book, Dr. Kristjanson gave it the highest praise and encouraged her to write a sequel to it, which she realized with her 1997 children's book, Huldufolk Forever Friends. Arnason has since written a series of young adult novels called the Huldufolk Trilogy, and is in the process of writing her 6th book on the subject of the Gimli Huldufolk. By way of apology for my inaccuracies, I've invited Kathleen to tell the true story of the Gimli Huldufolk in her own words. What follows are excerpts from my recent interview with Kathleen Arnason, author of The Story of the Gimli Huldufolk, Huldufolk Forever Friends, and the Huldufolk Trilogy. Enjoy.
Hi, my name's Kathleen Arnason, and I'm the author of The Story of the Gimli Huldufolk. Gimli, like I do say in the beginning of the book of The Story of the Gimli Huldufolk, that Gimli is a magical town. I can't imagine anything better than being a child in Gimli, certainly at the time I was a child in Gimli. Beaches, this lake, the freedom, it was pretty awesome growing up in Gimli. And it's a lovely town. My father was mayor of Gimli for 14 years, and Gimli almost became like a fourth sister in our home. So Gimli is, very, very special to me and very much a part of who I am. When I was a child, I was visited by these little people that would come out of my closet and then stand around my bed and just look at me. And this happened over and over again. And honestly, today I can almost see, I can see them and they're about as alive to me today as they were when they were little. Now I don't see them, I hear them in sort of creative ways. If I close my eyes and imagine myself lying in a bed and I'm 8 years old, I can see them all. I can see them all. I can see all their faces. And that wasn't not real to me. That was very, very real. It wasn't like I was making it up. They came out of the closet at first, and often I didn't have the closet door closed in my bedroom. I would have gone to sleep, and then I'd wake up, and there they were, all coming out of the closet, and then they would stand around the bed. And they'd just look at me, and they'd bend their heads, and then they'd come a little closer, but never, and there was nothing ever, I was never afraid of them. Then they would, I'd call for my mom, and she'd come in and flick the light on, and the next thing I knew, they were gone. And then she'd go back to bed, and the next night, the same thing would happen. But I didn't always call her. And then I thought, well, maybe I should just shut the door and then they won't come to visit. No, I liked them, but I thought maybe they should, there was a point where I thought I was sort of feeling, whoa, my goodness, they're coming every night. And I wanted a break. I just wanted to go to sleep. And so I shut the closet door. Well, they opened it. They just learned to open it. It was, I don't know, maybe it was a half a year that went on. Then after that, I didn't see them again. There's a lot of people who have also had the honor and experience to be able to see, be able to have seen little people, look them straight in the face. And it's as real to them as it was for me. And there's a lot of other cultures who are really respectful of that. That if you were a person who got to see a little person, then, they honor that. When I was about 16 would be the first time I went to Iceland. Yeah, the first trip to Iceland that I had, I went with we called her Amma Ella. She was the sister to my grandmother. And the two of us went alone. But it was so interesting because the people looked like people I knew. The language was a language I'd heard since I was a child. And the food was food that I'd eaten as a child as well. So it was like going home. And of course, you go to Iceland and your relatives talk about all the different places that are special. And one of them, or numerous places, they would tell me about, that Huldufolk lived there. And I sort of felt like an Irish child who never knew about the little people in Ireland. And I came home and I said to my parents, I said, how come you didn't tell us about Huldufolk? Huldufolk are magical. They're amazing. And we should be talking about these stories about the Huldufolk. You talk about other stories. You talk about ghosts and, other Icelandic folklore, but you never told us about the Huldufolk. And none of my friends knew about the Huldufolk either. So, that was quite exciting, actually, to learn about them. They're hidden people. They're people that live in the underground, that live in stones. And they play tricks. Sometimes they're good. Sometimes they're, usually tricks aren't good. People don't look at them as a good thing. But they do good things for people. And sometimes they play tricks on people. There's Huldufolk in Iceland. There's Huldufolk in Norway. There's Huldufolk in Sweden. The word Huldufolk is actually a term that's used in Scandinavia, not just Iceland, that they describe the little people that live in the ground. Yeah, they're little people that live. They're people that live in the earth and in stones. Yeah, and some in my closet. I started working with Leo Kristjanson. We were both members of the Gimli Heritage Committee, and we worked on the school, the Gimli School, for 4 years. And I was lucky enough. I mean, my dad had died, and I had quit writing children's stories, and then this amazing man came into my life, and he mentored me. Leo mentored me for 4 years while we worked on that school together. And I used to tease him all the time. I'd say, Leo, if you weren't so big and so tall, you could have been a Huldufolk. But of course, you're too big for a Huldufolk. And we'd laugh. And then we went up into the attic one day, and there in the attic, we started talking about Huldufolk. And I said, I think Huldufolk would live in this attic. And then the next thing I know, one of our members on the committee was phoning me saying, you know what? Leo thinks that Huldufolk are living in the attic. And I said, oh, he hasn't lost his mind. It's okay. We were up there and we were talking Huldufolk talk. So then after that, we were thinking of ways of how we would be able to promote the community spirit in the town. And I said, well, I think Huldufolk would be a way to do that. We talked a little bit about that, and I said, I think we should write a book. And he was thinking of somebody else to write it, but in his very wonderful Machiavellian way, he was a good Machiavellian person, he knew that I'd quit writing, because he knew that through our conversations. And my dad had passed and hadn't written a word since then. The most exciting thing was that this book really brought purpose into my life. I decided that I'd be writing the book. Jerry Johnson, who actually illustrated the Huldufolk, he said to me, well, what does a Huldufolk look like? I said, go home, have a dream. Whatever you dream is what the Huldufolk look like. So he came back and Snorri and Snaebjorn were born on a visual level. And we felt that we had to give them a visual image because it would engage the children more. And the only permission I needed from Leo was to make him a character. I really felt that I wanted to find a way to honor this amazing man, that if I could make him a character in the book, he would live on, because as I've just learned over the last 3 weeks with my time in Ireland, is that when we quit telling stories, they die. When we quit telling stories about people, the stories about the people die. Then they end up in archives, so they're kept safe. But we have to keep telling these stories. So making Leo a character in the book was my gift back to him for all he had given me. My relationship with Leo Kristjanson was very special. How many people can say that they've spent almost, close to 4 years with the president of a university, mentoring them about life. And the one thing that Leo did for me is he did get me back writing. And it was his, challenging me. But at the same time, so I wrote the story of the Gimli Huldufolk, and he goes, good job, but one book doesn't make a writer. And I went, oh, okay. So then I wrote a second book. And he goes, ooh, nice book, good book. 2 books don't make a writer. And I went, okay. And then so I wrote a third book. And then when I saw him, he said, well, 3rd time lucky, 3 books doesn't make a writer. And I thought, when do you get to be a writer? And then I wrote a 4th book. And he goes, it's pretty good. 4 books, you're getting there. And then I wrote a 5th book. And he said, I remember the day because he came over and he took my hand and he shook my hand. And he said, you're a writer. Besides that, how incredible. He loved kids. And when the children would come to the school, he would be engaging with them. And he had these monstrous feet, these incredibly big feet. And he was so tall. He had to be 6'7". The kids would be looking way up at him and they'd see these giant feet. And he would engage with them and they'd be laughing. So if Leo was in the book and Leo was real and the school was real, why would the Huldufolk not be real? So up they would go, climbing that stairwell, the circular staircase that we had going up into the attic, where the little beds are, and there was a little bookcase full of small Shakespeare poetry and stories and his works. There were little teacups and beds, and there was a great big trunk. There, of course, it still is, and it's all still there. And many, many children have gone up those stairs. There's a big, big trunk there, and you lifted the trunk, and there were letters and coloring pictures that the children had done that they left there for the Huldufolk. It was so exciting that the community had embraced the Huldufolk that Jerry and I had the Manitoba Theatre Centre build huge ones, big costumed Huldufolk. So they could walk around the town and they could engage the people on the streets, and people would stop them, and they still do to this day, to take pictures. And we're going on a 3rd generation of people whose children have gone up into the attic. And if they want to get up there with them, they can't go alone. They have to take a child with them. That's the only way an adult gets up into the Huldufolk attic. The big Huldufolk would be in parades. And actually, CBC did a Christmas special down at the Forks in Winnipeg, and the Huldufolk actually were the main characters in their program, along with Santa. But it was amazing that they had so much fun doing it. And so it's years and years and years, going on 30 actually, close to 30 years, that the Huldufolk have been walking the streets of Gimli, have been playing tricks on people, that the children have been writing letters to. I think the Huldufolk have played a really wonderful role in the town of Gimli. So I think what the story of the Gimli Huldufolk and how it came to be was to really identify community spirit. And it has been true to that. I feel I can stand or sit here as I say that and say the Gimli Huldufolk are a part of the Gimli community spirit. Every time I went to a school to read and do a creative writing workshop with the children, the little girls came up and they said to me, "How come there are no girl Huldufolks?" And I said, "Oh, they just haven't arrived yet. Iceland's far away, but I'm sure one day they're going to arrive." So I created the opportunity for the girls to come over and be the forever friends. The sequel to the story of the Gimli Huldufolk, it's been an extremely rewarding 25, almost 30 years, as I said earlier, of writing about the Huldufolk, to the point where I've actually written a trilogy that takes the Huldufolk from Gimli onto another adventure with friends and animals and other spirit people and fairies from other cultures, that they go on a quest right across the country to save the world against what's called the following spell, where people have quit using their imaginations and children can no longer see Huldufolk. As they work together on this journey as friends, and more friends come into it, and you learn all kinds of things about other cultures. You know, I brought an indigenous little person into my first book of the trilogy. That's a Memengwisi, and they live in the holes along rivers and along the banks of rivers in holes and along lakes in holes. And, they've been seen. There's they call them blue-cap ghosts that live in the underground mines between Drumheller and Wynyard, Saskatchewan. And that's a lore that exists. And that's in the book. And the Huldufolk meet the blue-cap ghosts. And part of the lore is that if you're going to go walking across the prairie, the upper landscape of where these underground mines were, you have to make sure you bring something to offer the blue-cap ghosts, because the miners had to give the blue-cap ghosts gold or something precious so that they would find more of what they were mining. And if they didn't feel that they were properly reimbursed, then the blue-cap ghosts had, would make sure something happened to the miner. They travel up the mountain of Mount Gimli. To my knowledge, anyway, I was the first person from Gimli to climb Mount Gimli. Now, I didn't climb the mountain, but I did climb up to the base camp. It's a very beautiful mountain, and it's just past Nelson, BC. And in the Valhalla range. Yeah, it's so the Huldufolk visit Mount Gimli. There's also the ghosts. They meet the ghosts at the Empress. And then they go and they actually visit and have a battle at Lonely Doug at Fairy Creek. You could actually, with the trilogy, you could go on a journey yourself. You could follow the Huldufolk on their journey and go to all the places that they go to where the portals existed, so that they would be able to learn the 7 sacred teachings. of the Indigenous people. Yeah, it's the trilogy is, it's quite a journey. I've had a lot of young teenage, 12, 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds. One little girl has read the trilogy 3 times over, waiting for me to finish this next book. And her grandmother keeps saying, "When's your next book coming out?" And I go, "Well, it has to be written yet." And she goes, "My granddaughter, she's read the trilogy 3 times. And one thing about the trilogy I'm really proud of is it's been printed in a dyslexic font. I'm dyslexic myself. It wasn't easy as a kid going through school. I had one young lady, which is in her, I call her young because she's 30. She picked up one of my books and she started reading it out loud, and she started crying. And she said, "This is the first time I have ever been able to read out loud." Because the font gives your eyes the opportunity to rest, and you don't get exhausted. And the spacing and the shadowing of the font and the spaces between the lines, incredible. It's anybody, if you picked it up and read it, you would realize how relaxing it is to read it, even if your eyesight and your mind is working normally, and it's not having to, decipher letters that get turned backwards. But yeah, so I'm kind of proud of that. I think Leo would be really proud. I don't like to speak for somebody who's not here, but I think he would be really proud of this trilogy. And I think he was very proud of the 2 children's Huldufolk books. And he was a huge influence in my life. And I enjoyed every moment I had with him, working on the school and just talking about life. So, yeah, he might have been too big to be a Huldufolk, but he had the Huldufolk spirit.
If you'd like to get a copy of Kathleen Arnason's Huldufolk Trilogy as a Christmas gift for a child or young adult in your life, you can find it online at Kathleen's website, huldufolkhouse.com, link in description, and at the McNally Robinson Bookstore in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and at Turgeson's General Store in Gimli, Manitoba.